So I thought today I'd share with you some of my discoveries in using these cheap watercolour pencils to make some pretty backgrounds. So these Shaw and Marsh watercolour pencils are really, I don't feel like they're very good quality. I've already done a review of these and I'll pop the link in the video description if you'd like to take a look at that. So for these experiments I'm using 190 GSM watercolour paper. So firstly, I thoroughly wet my paper with clean tap water. Now I don't have a very big brush to do this with, so it did take a little bit of time. On some of the later pages that I did, I decided to use two brushes together, just for speed. So the basic method of making these watercolour backgrounds using cheap watercolour pencils is to wet your brush and then run it around the nib of the watercolour pencil, flicking it as you go. What this does is it deposits drops of the pigmented water onto the page. Now with these pencils, some of the colours were more vibrant than others, and with those that were less vibrant, I'd get a very washed out result. In doing this, the water and the pigment spreads out really well, but it also leaves spots of colour that kind of blend organically together. And once your page is really wet with all these flicks and splashes, if you tilt the very wet page, it creates a much more drippy watercolour effect. And as with watercolour painting, if there's too much water, you can dab it away with some kitchen towel or tissue paper. Oh, just another note, I did try this method with my Lonely Blue Caran d'Ache watercolour pencil, and what I found was that the colour was so much more vibrant using the Caran d'Ache pencils. But for these experiments I decided to stick with the cheap Shaw and Marsh pencils and to keep the result a little bit more subtle. So once the paper was almost dry, I repeated the flicking of the paint onto the page. At this point I'd figured out that it would leave more defined spots on the page. Because the page wasn't as wet, the colours weren't spreading out quite as much. What I also did was I'd wet the brush and very briefly dab it on a kitchen towel, then run it around the nib and flick it. I mean, it's basic science, I suppose. The less water you use, the more colour, but you do need enough water to create the initial flick. So the backgrounds are a little bit random, but you can direct the colour a little bit, as in you can put one colour at the top and one colour at the bottom. It's also a little bit messy, but less so than flicking with actual watercolour paint. If I compare the watercolour pencil backgrounds to the watercolour paint backgrounds, there are a lot fewer cauliflowers with the watercolour pencil. However, the paint splashes I found were much more defined when using watercolour paint. And also the watercolour paint is much more vibrant. So in my efforts to try and make some use of these watercolour pencils, I decided to try a few little experiments. The first one was to scrape some of the pigment from the watercolour pencil directly onto a wet background, and I did this using a craft knife. It's very simple to do. It's quite hard to control where the pigment is landing, although I suppose you could scrape the pigment off into a little cup and then sprinkle the pigment onto the page. For the end result of this one, I did feel that the pigmented areas did look a little bit grainy, and overall I think I prefer the paint flicking method. So then I tried the good old favourite salt experiment, and for this one I created a much more colourful background using the flicking method, and I still tried to keep the page really, really wet. I really liked how this one turned out, and in retrospect I wish I'd have let it dry as it was and not carried on with the salt part. However, I didn't. So I used some Maldon sea salt and I sprinkled it very liberally over the page, and it looked much more impressive whilst it was wet on the page than it did dry. The dry result, well, I did get a few cauliflowers, strangely enough, and I hadn't experienced these with just the flicking method. And the end result is very, very grainy, and in places it just seemed like the pigment was just sitting on the water and not blending as well. So the salt clearly does something different with the watercolour pencils than it does with watercolour paint. But yeah, once dry, as always, the salt does leave slightly raised areas, but I do kind of like the glistening effect that the salt has on this page, and that might be usable in future projects. So I hope this video has given you a very, very brief insight in how to use your cheap watercolour pencils to make some pretty backgrounds. I hope that you might have found something useful from this, but if you have any further tips or tricks to share, do leave them in the comments below.